Hi, this is Ted, and for the next hour, you'll be listening to a reading of articles and features from the Monday, May 17th New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. This is a really important article. Trump administration live updates. $1.8 billion fund could funnel money to Trump allies. The Trump administration announced on Monday the creation of a $1.8 billion fund to compensate those who claim they were targeted by the Biden Justice Department and Democrats, forging a pipeline to funnel taxpayer money to Trump's allies. The highly unusual anti-weaponization fund, denounced by critics as a political slush fund, was unveiled just after Trump withdrew his lawsuit against the Internal Revenue Service, demanding at least $10 billion. It was an apparent effort to skirt oversight by the judge in the case who had expressed concern that the suit represented self-dealing between the president and a department run by his former defense lawyer, Todd Blanche. The tandem moves amounted to an end run that appeared to strip Judge Kathleen Williams, who had been overseeing the IRS case in the Southern District of Florida, of her appointed role in approving a formal settlement agreement. By dismissing the case in its entirety, Trump was able to reach an agreement with his own appointees without risking the rebuke of an impartial and independent arbiter. The cash value of the fund was set at $1.776 billion, a nod to the nation's founding. Isn't that cute? The Justice Department added in its announcement that its creation was intended to provide a systematic process to hear and redress claims of others who suffered weaponization and lawfare, though it offered few other details, including who might qualify. In addition to withdrawing his suit against the IRS, Trump will also drop separate administrative claims. Those include his demand the government pay him $230 million for investigations into his 2016 campaign's potential ties to Russia and into his handling of classified documents after he left office. Trump, his two sons, and his family business who sued the IRS together would receive an apology but not be paid out of the new fund, the official said. It remains unclear if the announcement represents a serious effort to disperse cash or a provocative distraction intended to provide the president with political cover as he retreats from a dubious lawsuit he was about to lose, or some combination of both. Trump and the department's leadership have repeatedly accused Democrats of weaponizing federal law enforcement against their enemies. They have yet to provide evidence of illegality or political animus in the two federal prosecutions of Trump or in investigations of his allies. The acting Attorney General, Todd Blanche, said in a statement, "The machinery of government should never be weaponized against any American, and it is this department's intention to make right the wrongs that were previously done while ensuring this never happens again. As part of this settlement, we are setting up a lawful process for victims of lawfare and weaponization to be heard and seek redress." A memo signed by Blanche, just over 1 page in length, offered only the vaguest outline of how the fund will operate. It did not define weaponization, specify the process by which claims would be assessed, or even enumerate the actual amount of money that would be distributed. The amount specified in the department's news release, with its symbolic value, 1776, does not represent the value of any claim by plaintiffs, but rather is based on the projected valuation of future claimants' claims, Mr. Blanche wrote. Money for the fund will come from a special unlimited account available to the Justice Department for settling lawsuits. That pool of money gives the department the authority to make monetary settlements without needing approval from Congress. A group of 5 people, selected by Mr. Blanche, of course, will oversee the operations of the fund, though Trump can fire its members at will. It will stop processing claims on December 15, 2028, weeks before Trump leaves office. Creation of the fund, which could be used to compensate Trump supporters who ransacked the Capitol on January 6, 2021, is sure to please a president who has demanded not only retribution, but recompense. But it could create major political problems for congressional Republicans already dealing with the political ballast of his unpopularity and who will now be forced to say if they support or oppose allocating taxpayer cash to his allies at a time when many Americans are struggling economically. This is one of the most corrupt acts in American history, said Donald K. Sherman, president of the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, a nonprofit legal watchdog group. Stacey Young, the founder of Justice Connection, a network of former department employees, said the fund fit a larger pattern of corruption that is eroding DOJ's integrity and Americans' faith in the rule of law. Potential recipients were thrilled. Mark McCloskey, a St. Louis-based lawyer best known for having brandished an AR-15-style rifle during a racial justice protest outside his home 6 years ago, had tried for nearly a year to get compensation from the government for about 430 January 6 defendants, but repeatedly ran into opposition from Blanche and others in the Justice Department. But Mr. McCloskey hailed the announcement of the fund, saying that he would seek money from it for his current clients and that he expected more January 6th rioters to come forward asking for payouts. I was somewhat skeptical at first because lots of things get said, McCloskey said, but it looks like this is a done deal. Judge Williams had been considering dismissing Trump's IRS suit on her own because he effectively controls both his personal lawyers bringing the complaint and the government lawyers who are supposed to respond to it. She had ordered the Justice Department, which has yet to make an appearance or filing in the case, and Trump's lawyers to brief her by Wednesday to explain whether they were actually in opposition or were colluding to achieve a mutually agreeable outcome. In their filing on Monday, Trump's lawyers said their dismissal meant that no judicial analysis is appropriate for the suit. The substance of Trump's suit stems from the leak of his tax returns to the New York Times in 2019. Trump, two of his sons, and his family business argue that the IRS should have done more to prevent a former contractor from leaking tax information to the Times and to ProPublica. While federal law allows for people to sue the IRS when their tax information is leaked, legal experts saw clear flaws in Trump's suit and said the Justice Department had defended other similar cases brought by plaintiffs who were not the president. Just minutes after Trump's lawyers informed Judge Williams of their intention to dismiss the suit, 93 Democratic lawmakers filed court papers accusing the Justice Department of having colluded with Trump and asking the judge to throw out the case herself. Never in the history of the U.S. has a sitting president sought a monetary settlement from the government he leads, let alone sought many billions of dollars in taxpayer funds, lawyers for the lawmakers wrote. The filing by the lawmakers suggested how jarringly Trump's moves had short-circuited normal court business. The president's lawyers essentially beat the lawmakers to the draw by dismissing the case on their own, hamstringing the lawmakers' ability to stop a settlement from going through. But lawyers for the lawmakers argued the judge still had the power not to accept the dismissal, given its unusual nature. It is also possible to bring a separate lawsuit directly challenging the validity of the compensation fund, but it remains unclear who would have the legal standing to do so. And speaking of corruption, here's an article, The Big Questions About Jeffrey Epstein, What the Times Has Learned. Few, if any, figures in recent history have caused as much legal, political, financial, and reputational upheaval as Jeffrey Epstein, a convicted sex offender. Mr. Epstein was connected to many of the world's richest and most influential people and institutions. He died in prison in 2019. The public fascination with Epstein intensified after Trump initially refused to release federal investigative records, after pledging to do so. In late 2025 and early 2026, Congress and the Justice Department did release millions of pages of documents related to Epstein that have helped answer questions, though many mysteries remain. The New York Times has been investigating Epstein's finances, enablers, and possible co-conspirators since his arrest on federal federal sex trafficking charges in 2019. Based on our continuing reporting, here is what we know. What did he do to girls and women? Epstein has been accused by prosecutors and victims of raping, abusing, and trafficking girls and young women. It was a vast, years-long operation that involved recruiting girls who said they were raped or sexually abused. In the mid-2000s, federal and state authorities identified more than a dozen such teenage girls in Florida. In many cases, Epstein's longtime companion, Ghislaine Maxwell, recruited them under the pretense that they would be masseuses for a wealthy man at his mansion in Palm Beach. Federal prosecutors later accused Epstein of abusing and trafficking dozens of girls at his townhouse in Manhattan, as well as in Palm Beach, from at least 2002 to 2005. He lured some by posing as a talent scout for Victoria's Secret. After he served time in Florida jail for soliciting prostitution from a minor, he appears to have shifted focus from underage victims to young women. He was often surrounded by aspiring models from Russia and Eastern Europe, some of whom later said they felt trapped under his control. Some have accused several of his friends and associates of rape, though the men deny it. The women have accused him of raping or abusing them, including when they were girls, allegations that in some cases date to the early 1900s. How did he get away with it for so long? The federal government repeatedly missed opportunities to fully investigate or charge Epstein until 2019. The missteps and lost opportunities include, in 1996, Maria Farmer called the FBI to tell the agency that Epstein had stolen nude photos of her underage sister. It ignored the tip for roughly a decade. In 2005, the parents of a 14-year-old girl told the Palm Beach police that she had been paid to give a sexual massage to Mr. Epstein. That set off a state and federal investigation. While the authorities identified dozens of underage victims, the Justice Department, including the U.S. Attorney for Southern Florida at the time, Alexander Acosta, negotiated a deal. He pleaded guilty to soliciting prostitution from just one minor. That agreement also shielded any potential co-conspirators, including his female assistants, from prosecution. Though Epstein served his sentence in the county stockade, he was allowed to spend much of his jail time working from his office. After being released early from his 18-month sentence, Epstein was welcomed back into elite society, attending parties, hosting dinners, and continuing to do business with major financial institutions. In the 2010s, a number of federal agencies, including the Drug Enforcement Administration, investigated Epstein, but he wasn't charged. Where did all his money come from? He amassed a 9-figure fortune through scams, fraud, and the careful cultivation of billionaires and banks. His financial success involved making key connections in the 70s at a prominent investment bank. His first big break was landing a job at Bear Stearns in 1976. He eventually resigned after being caught improperly lending money to a client and violating rules around stock offerings, but he used the connections he forged there to jumpstart his career as a financial trickster. He duped the wealthy into giving him large sums for investments that never seemed to materialize. He nurtured a lucrative relationship with the billionaire behind Victoria's Secret and The Limited. In the late 1980s, a mutual acquaintance introduced him to Leslie Wexner, who ran the two retail companies. Wexner entrusted Epstein with full control over his finances before cutting ties with him around 2007. Mr. Wexner later said that Epstein stole more than $100 million from him. You'd think he would have noticed. In the meantime, you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. Receiving $170 million from another billionaire client. In 2012, Epstein began working for his longtime friend Leon Black, the co-founder of the private equity firm Apollo Global Management, who said the money was for tax and estate planning work. Epstein also introduced Mr. Black to young women. He got money and services from J.P. Morgan Chase, the country's largest bank. From the late 1990s through 2013, J.P. Morgan Chase, arguably the world's most prestigious bank, serviced Mr. Epstein despite employees' concerns about his potential money laundering. In 2013, he switched to Deutsche Bank, which also ignored repeated red flags. How did he build his network? The combination of great wealth and a reputation for seeming to know everyone enabled Epstein to insinuate himself into the lives of important people in politics, business, the arts, and academia. His strategy entailed doling out millions of dollars to entice people into his orbit. As his fortune grew, Epstein made big donations to prestigious universities like Harvard and to individual scientists. The money led Nobel laureates and other leading intellectual figures to regularly socialize and seek favor from him, and their presence helped grow his circle of influence. Traded favors with prominent doctors, financiers, and academics. Some of the doctors and others bent or broke the ethical rules of their profession, which allowed Epstein to offer perks to other acquaintances, like access to premier medical care, investment opportunities with hedge funds, or a potential edge in school admissions. He flaunted his connections to a who's who of the global power elite. Epstein's vast Manhattan townhouse became the venue for regular dinner salons for an eclectic mix of artists, scientists, intellectuals, lawyers, and businessmen. Visitors were greeted with photo arrays exhibiting Epstein's ties to the ruling class. And he used his ties to Bill Clinton to cement his reputation. One of his most valuable connections was to the former president. The relationship helped catapult Epstein into the public spotlight and secure his image as a whisperer to the rich and powerful. He also cultivated relationships with Wall Street players and foreign dignitaries. Epstein boasted extensive Wall Street connections to CEOs like James Kane and Jess Staley, investment tycoons like Glenn Dubin and Mr. Black, and powerful lawyers like Brad Karp and Kathy Rumler. And he collected high-profile friends and associates overseas, including Prince Andrew, the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, and top Norwegian politicians. What were his relationships with Trump and Clinton? Epstein was friends with Trump long before he became president, and he developed a relationship with Clinton during his time in the White House. Those relationships involved bonding with Trump over their pursuit of young women. The two men became good friends in the late 1980s, hanging out together at casinos, Mr. Trump's Mar-a-Lago estate, and other venues. A note and sexually suggestive drawing containing what appeared to be Trump's signature was included in the 2003 book for Epstein's birthday. Trump has denied writing the note. Some of Epstein's victims, including Ms. Joffrey, were recruited by Maxwell from Trump's Florida club and residence, where Ms. Joffrey worked as a spa attendant. Trump said last year that he cut ties with Epstein in the early 2000s because he stole his female employees, although the relationship also deteriorated when the men fought over a piece of Florida real estate. Shortly after Clinton was sworn in as president, Epstein made his first visit to the White House. Visitor logs show that he came back numerous times during Clinton's first term, though it's unclear how often he met the president. In 1995, Clinton wrote a get well soon note to Epstein's mother on a Post-it. In 2002, after Clinton left the White House, Epstein flew him and others to several African countries. The trip was one of the first times that Epstein attracted significant media attention. Epstein's New York mansion showcased photos of him with both Trump and Clinton. When Trump became president, Epstein at times presented himself as someone who had inside knowledge about the administration, though it was most likely an act. Both Trump and Clinton have said they knew nothing about his criminal activity. Why weren't more people charged? Epstein's inner circle and the financiers and banks that enabled him faced allegations of wrongdoing, but U.S. prosecutors charged only one person other than Epstein. The legal trail included the conviction of Ghislaine Maxwell for conspiring to sexually abuse girls. She is the only person other than Epstein to face criminal charges in the U.S. In 2021, she was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Some Republicans have expressed support for the idea that Trump could pardon her. In the months after Epstein's death, federal authorities investigated a number of Epstein's former personal assistants who were accused by some victims of participating in his sex trafficking operation. Prosecutors considered charging at least one, but they ultimately opted not to, perhaps because she said she was also one of his victims. Federal prosecutors apparently didn't interview or subpoena Mr. Wexner, Mr. Black, and Epstein's longtime accountant Richard Kahn and lawyer Darren Indyke. A federal document described Wexner as a co-conspirator, though his spokesman denied that the government ever considered him one. Federal authorities interviewed women who accused Mr. Black and Mr. Staley, a former top J.P. Morgan executive, of sexual misconduct, allegations that both men deny. Prosecutors relayed those accusations to officials in the Manhasset District Attorney's Office, which did not bring charges. As part of their investigation into Epstein, federal prosecutors subpoenaed the two banks that provided him with the greatest financial support, J.P. Morgan and Deutsche Bank. The prosecutors appeared to have quickly decided against charging either institution with wrongdoing. Police departments and prosecutors in some other countries recently have taken a more aggressive approach. In Britain, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, the former prince, and Peter Mandelson, a former top government official, have been arrested in connection with Epstein investigations, though neither has been charged. And another interesting story, if I can get it here. Abortion pill lawsuit leaves Trump silent and in a political bind. This is by Pam Belloc and Cheryl Gay Stolberg. With the midterm elections less than 6 months away, Republicans are facing challenging political headwinds, including an unpopular war, escalating inflation, and Trump's sinking approval ratings. Now another issue is putting the administration in a political bind: abortion. 4 years after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, which established a national right to abortion in 1973, it remains widely available, and the number of abortions per year has actually increased slightly. Much of that is due to the availability of abortion pills. The Food and Drug Administration has so far not walked away from a decision made during the Biden administration to allow access to the abortion pill mifepristone through the mail. But a lawsuit against the FDA now threatens that access, and the Trump administration has remained strikingly silent about it, even as the case reaches the Supreme Court this month. The suit brought by the state of Louisiana led a federal appeals court to temporarily bar a policy allowing abortion providers to prescribe mifepristone through telemedicine and send it by mail. Responding to emergency appeals from two mifepristone manufacturers, the Supreme Court twice paused that ruling and then last week restored telemedicine and mail access indefinitely, while litigation continues in the lower courts. Through all the back and forth, Trump, who calls himself the most pro-life president in history, stayed mum. His Justice Department, whose job it is to defend the FDA in the case, declined to submit a brief to the Supreme Court, a highly unusual decision. That they're the folks who are most directly affected by the litigation and they're not filing anything, that's shocking, said Samuel Bagenstos, who was the general counsel for the Department of Health and Human Services, which oversees the FDA during the Biden administration. I think it reflects the very difficult political position that the Trump administration is in. Strategists for both parties say the president is navigating a tricky political calculus. A majority of the public favors widespread access to abortion pills. Trump can stay quiet about the case and incur the wrath of anti-abortion leaders who view his silence as a betrayal and might stay home from the polls in November, or he can voice his support for restricting access, which would inevitably fire up Democrats and independents to vote in greater numbers. For the moment, at least, he's chosen to remain quiet. But the case is still energizing both sides. They don't want this going into the midterm election. Well, unfortunately, they just got it, said Tony Perkins, president of the Family Research Council, a conservative group that opposes abortion and has been increasingly frustrated by the president's inaction on the issue in his second term. He added, it's only going to stay in the news. It's only going to become more of the narrative going into the midterm. Mini Timuraju, the president and chief executive of Reproductive Freedom for All, said in a statement that the case underscores the importance of voting this fall. Mifepristone is safe, effective, and backed by decades of evidence, but anti-abortion extremists drag this baseless case through the courts as part of their efforts to ban abortion nationwide, she said, adding, this is exactly why the midterm elections are critical. We need leaders at every level of government to stop these attacks. More than 100 studies and years of FDA review have consistently found that mifepristone is safe and that serious complications from taking it are rare. It's the first pill taken in a two-drug medication abortion regimen that has become the method used in nearly two-thirds of abortions in the U.S. Pills are now mailed to about 100,000 patients per year in states that have banned or severely restricted abortion. The FDA eased restrictions on the strictly regulated drug in 2021, dropping a requirement that patients get mifepristone in person and allowing doctors to prescribe it via telemedicine and send it through the mail. Trump's FDA has kept that policy intact, saying that it will make a determination after it reviews the drug's safety, a study that administration officials have repeatedly said will not be finished for months. After last week's Supreme Court ruling, the agency promised to press forward to finish the study and said it would provide updates as key milestones are reached. In fact, that study has not even begun, according to two people with detailed knowledge of the effort. It's been held up for months, these people said, by delays at the Department of Health and Human Services headquarters, which slowed the FDA's efforts to update a sophisticated set of databases from electronic health records and insurance carriers that are necessary for the research. Opponents of abortion have accused the agency and the president of slow-walking the study until after the midterms. Opposition to abortion animated Republicans for decades, helping to elect candidates and driving voters to the polls. That changed, however, after the court's decision in 2022 to overturn Roe v. Wade. Democrats were expected to take a drubbing that year. The party in power generally loses congressional seats in midterm elections. Instead, they suffered relatively minor losses in the House and they picked up a seat in the Senate. Political strategists in both parties attribute the outcome to the rise of abortion as a salient issue, a finding confirmed by post-election analysis by the California Institute of Technology. Whit Ayers, a Republican strategist, said abortion had not been expected to be a major issue this year. Voters are consumed with the economy and the war with Iran. Asked why the administration might be reluctant to talk about the mifepristone case, his answer was brief and to the point. Because I think they see it as a losing issue, he said. Trump was once a hero to the anti-abortion movement. When he first ran for president in 2016, Marjorie Dannenfelser, the president of the anti-abortion group Susan B. Anthony Pro-Life America, rallied her members to support him after he signed a pledge to appoint Supreme Court justices who would overturn Roe. That support helped propel Trump to the White House, and when he got there, he made good on the promise. But anti-abortion activists now fault him because his administration has not used its power to prevent the mailing of abortion pills, or the presidential bully puppet, or or the presidential bully pulpit to voice support for a national abortion ban. I think that the administration has been extremely selective with how they have impacted pro-life policy, said Gavin Oxley, a spokesman for the anti-abortion group Americans United for Life, adding that it's notable that the administration has not touched probably the most significant Biden-era abortion policy and has allowed it to stand. And you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. 68% of American adults oppose banning mifepristone, and 65% oppose making it a crime for healthcare providers to mail abortion pills to patients in states where abortion is banned, according to a December 2025 survey. The survey also found that 4 in 10 Americans were not sure about mifepristone's safety. Ashley Kurzinger, who oversees polling on the issue, said the organization was conducting additional research on the perception of the drug's safety to learn whether opinion has been shifting as abortion opponents criticize abortion pills. Louisiana, one of 20 states that ban or restrict abortion, sued in October to block the policy allowing telemedicine and mailing. The state claimed that the policy was adopted without adequate review and that it violated the state's sovereignty by allowing Louisiana residents to receive the medication despite the strict abortion ban there. While some Republican strategists would have preferred to see the case remain in the lower courts and out of the headlines, in Louisiana, a red state with a large Catholic population, politicians see little risk in an aggressive approach to shutting down access to abortion there and across the country. The Louisiana Attorney General, Liz Murrill, has been pushing the mifepristone case more aggressively than other conservative states that have filed similar suits, asking the courts to halt mifepristone mailing until the full lawsuit can be adjudicated. Louisiana has also initiated criminal cases against abortion providers in New York and California who have been prescribing and sending pills through the mail. And Louisiana's legislature passed a law to classify the 2 pills in the typical medication abortion regimen, mifepristone and misoprostol, as dangerous controlled substances. Robert Hogan, a political science professor at Louisiana State University, said many Republicans and anti-abortion activists in the state have made peace with Trump's relatively quiet approach to abortion in the second term. Nonetheless, the state's push has put some Republicans elsewhere in an ill-timed predicament. The White House's posture in the Louisiana lawsuit reflects that, said Katie Keith, director of the Center for Health Policy and the Law at Georgetown University. The Trump administration was trying to have it both ways, she said, and that's how they got themselves into, I think, a bit of a mess here. And here's an editorial by Frank Bruni called The Vanity and Inanity of Trump's White House. Befitting his home in the Trump administration, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. practices the politics of narcissism. If I embrace it, it must be right. If I embody it, you should emulate it. I flaunt a sun-sizzled appearance, so you should have the same leathery license. About 2 months ago, the health secretary nixed a proposal by the Food and Drug Administration to make tanning beds, like alcohol and cigarettes, off limits to minors. That development didn't get extensive news media attention. It couldn't compete with all the salvos being exchanged between the U.S. and Iran, between President Trump and the Pope, and it arguably had marginal significance. The proposal had been on the books unimplemented for more than a decade. Kennedy wasn't changing the policy, he was killing a possibility. But why this one? Why bother? Is there some melanoma lobby we don't know about? Needn't he conserve his energy for his shirtless workouts and his mindless conspiracy theories? He cited the importance of personal choice and the burden that tanning regulations would place on small businesses. But I think his attention to the matter reflected a particular obsession among Trump and his attendants. They're fixated on looks to a degree that's not remotely normal, in a manner that's positively cartoonish, with no appreciation for how much of themselves and their vacuous governing philosophy they're revealing. Never have I witnessed a White House so devoted to surfaces. Surfaces caked with makeup, surfaces puffed up with hairspray, surfaces glossed with gold, surfaces that glitter blue, or someday might if the over-budget overhaul of the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool ever works out as promised. Appearances simultaneously obscure reality and substitute for it. Your sheen is your success, and you are what you impersonate. Trump has long been known to judge potential cabinet secretaries and military leaders on whether they look the part, and that thinking factored into his embrace of Kevin Warsh, who was just confirmed by the Senate to be the new chair of the Federal Reserve. Sure, Warsh has an impressive resume, and he has signaled obeisance to a president who demands such submission, but he has an additional asset. Trump wrote, on top of everything else, he is central casting. According to an article by Eva Reutberg in Fortune magazine at the time, Trump once told Warsh during the 2019 in the White House, "You're a really handsome guy." To Trump, that's an important credential. All the World's a television show. Central casting is a recurring compliment, and handsomeness or beauty establishes a kind of superiority, which in turn bequeaths confidence, which then begets dominance. By his zoology, an aviary of peacocks equals a menagerie of lions. And what peacocks these putzes are! In many other milieux, Kristi Noem's comically voluminous tresses, suspiciously plump visage, and unsubtle makeup would be a waste of aggressive cosmetology. In Trump's circle, they established her as a fierce warrior goddess, Wonder Woman minus the golden lasso, and got her the title of Homeland Security Secretary for 13 sadistic months. In many other milieux, Pete Hegseth's habit of sharing videos of his workouts would be seen as a grossly self-enamored distraction. In Trump's circle, they're a testament to his tenacity. The defense secretary posted one such ode to his own musculature shortly before the beginning of the war with Iran, as U.S. warships headed toward that region. It showed him doing a bench press as the soldiers whom he gathered around him cheered, his wife applauded, and I guess the Ayatollahs quivered. Nothing spells imminent doom like a cabinet member's pecs. Kennedy has painstakingly sculpted and burnished his own physique through gym workouts, testosterone therapy, tanning. He has the same retrograde take on masculinity and male primping that Hegseth does, along with the same moth-to-flame fascination with social media, where he can be found pumping iron in jeans, ditching his shirt, soaking in a hot tub. Kid Rock joined him for cardio and calisthenics in a sauna. Hegseth joined him and beat him in a race to finish 100 push-ups and 50 pull-ups. Is this supposed to pass for inspiration? It's merely proof of perspiration, but it seems to raise rather than lower these exhibitions standing with the president. Trump treats physical vanity as a secret handshake, a sign that you get his egotistical ethos and you belong. If you're not strutting, you're not selling. Pitch and packaging are everything. Perfect them and you don't have to worry about the product itself. That thinking informs the cabinet secretary's physical preening just as it explains the president's oratorical preening, all those ludicrous superlatives, and his emphasis on costumes, scenery, and slogans. Remember those colorful charts in front of that gigantic American flag in the White House Rose Garden for the announcement of mathematically nonsensical tariffs that would come and go, increase and decrease, and ultimately be deemed illegal? Liberation Day was the semantic lipstick on that pig. The war with Iran is Operation Epic Fury, and it has demonstrated anew that the Trump administration's initiatives are lavishly marketed rather than carefully conceived. Assessments of the war's progress change daily, even hourly, and repeatedly turn out to be unreliable, because they're often just phrases put through the language equivalent of tanning beds to be given a glow and bronze just so. That's what's important, not the cancer growing beneath. Here's a guest essay called France Has a New Picture of the Holocaust. This is by Jean-Marc Dreyfus. In 1950, Robert Doisneau photographed a kiss you've surely seen. The man and woman seem to have been stopped by ardor amid the midday rush in front of the Hôtel de Ville in Paris. Though staged, it became nearly immediately one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. Surely unknown to Mr. Doisneau, 9 years earlier there was another kiss captured on film in Paris that was much more spontaneous, just as passionate, far more desperate, between two Jews about to be separated by Vichy police. This kiss, found on a contact sheet of Nazi propaganda images in a Rennes flea market 6 years ago, is now at the heart of a new exhibition of 98 Nazi propaganda photos at the Shoah Memorial in Paris, curated by Lior Lalieu and me. This kiss, perhaps destined to become just as iconic, reveals a very different mid-century Parisian moment. The photos provide a detailed visual account, almost minute by minute, of the very first and little-known roundup of Jews in France on May 14, 1941. That day, some 3,700 foreign-born Jews obeyed a summons by Paris police with a notice printed on light green paper. It became known as the Green Ticket Roundup, for what they believed would be merely a check of their immigration and identity papers. The operation was organized by a man named Theodor Dannecker, the envoy of Adolf Eichmann in Paris. A photographer with the Nazi propaganda unit in the city was on hand to observe. What gives these newly discovered photographs their singular power is not only what they show, but the fact that they survived at all. They remind us that the past is never entirely buried, and that images can unexpectedly return to challenge the void of memory and representation. They function today not as propaganda, the purpose for which they were originally produced, but as fragments of truth, painful, incomplete, and indispensable, that allow us to better understand the way the roundup was organized and conducted, and also to get a glimpse of the victims' shock, fear, and pain. There are only a few hundred photographs of roundups or murders of Jews from the 1930s and 40s, a disparity of mass proportion considering the extent of the genocide. Some were taken by victims as acts of resistance, some by bystanders, and others, like this collection, were by an authorized photographer for the Nazi propaganda machine. From time to time, grandchildren of Nazi perpetrators find these images in attics and boxes when the older generation passes away. This particular group of photographs was meant to document a Nazi success story. They begin with the trap. Jewish men and their spouses were summoned to over 60 locations in Paris, police offices, various administration and sports facility in the 11th arrondissement. Women, we know from eyewitness testimony, were asked to return home to gather items. A list was provided. When they returned, as the images we now have on hand show, they were barred from reuniting with their male relatives. The doors were closed and guarded by French policemen. We can see the women's pain, their bewilderment, many with bundles in their arms. We see couples as they part from each other. Other photos document the departure of guarded buses commandeered from the Paris Bus Company, filled with the captured men. We see the arrival of the internees at Paris's Austerlitz train station. The same photographer captures the imprisonment of these Jews a few days later at the French internment camps Pithiviers and Baume-la-Rolande. Some 700 of these Jewish men were later liberated or escaped after the Green Ticket Roundup. About 3,000 of those taken that day were later deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Of that group, just a scant few returned. Taken months before the decision to annihilate the Jews of Europe was made, these 98 photos do not show extermination camps, gas chambers, shootings, or even starvation. What they do show is the careful, methodical beginnings of racially motivated separation that later enabled the mass murder. The noted historian Raoul Hilberg called this phase of Nazi genocide concentration. There's no sign of outright violence. Indeed, the despair of the ensnared Jews and their bewildered spouses is shown with a strange sensitivity by the German photographer. At first, the photos were kept on file by the German propaganda unit in Paris. After the war, 6 of the 98 photos were found in the archives of the NIOD, Institute for War, Holocaust, and Genocide Studies in Amsterdam, an indication that they were shared among the various propaganda units across Western Europe. A few others circulated among archives, but the vast majority were languishing unseen on contact sheets until 2020, when two amateur collectors came upon them at a flea market. They brought the sheets to Ms. Lalieu, the director of photo collections at the Shoah Memorial in Paris, who analyzed the images in an effort to identify as many people as possible. She also identified the photographer as Harry Kroner, a man from Berlin who had gone on to have a stellar career in post-war West Berlin as a famous cinema and opera photographer. Half Jewish himself, he spent the end of the war in a labor camp. After the photos were found, Ms. Lalieu invited first and second generation survivors to the memorial in an attempt to identify their parents or grandparents in the pictures. There were some extraordinarily moving moments. Though only 5 attempts at identification were successful so far, each marks a small victory against the backdrop of Nazi cover-up and of the looming loss of memory. A few of the photographs were shared publicly for the first time in 2021. 1 year after these photos were taken, in mid-July 1942, about 13,000 Jews, mostly women and children, were rounded up, pulled out of Paris apartments, and taken to an indoor sporting arena, the Vélodrome d'Hiver, in southwestern Paris. They received little food or water and were subject to abject conditions. Depleted and distraught, they were sent from there to the internment camps of Drancy, Pithiviers, and Beaune-le-Roland. Later, a majority were sent on to Auschwitz. It was an arrest of mass proportions, a stain on French history. We know this history from eyewitness testimonies, from memoirs of the few survivors, and from the mass of police documents. Only a single photograph of the roundup is known. In it, 5 buses are parked alongside the Vélodrome d'Hiver. The image was most likely taken clandestinely from an overlooking window. With the discovery and exhibition of this new group of photographs, the picture and understanding of the Holocaust in France have deepened. The value of an image is entirely dependent on context. Taken to prove racial superiority, these 98 photos on display through December now show depravity. They also jar awake memory, shore it up against time. In an ephemeral era of mass documentation, of our own lives, of our public and private existence, the reemergence of these photographs is a tangible reminder that some images refuse to be erased from our collective past. And you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And another essay, this one by Lydia Polgreen, is called "Trump and His Advisors Clearly Haven't Actually Read Thucydides." In January, Stephen Miller gave a blustery and revealing interview to the CNN journalist Jake Tapper. Flush with the triumph of the military raid to abduct Venezuela's president, Nicolás Maduro, Miller was taking a victory lap. America was done being the world's nice guy, footing the bill for a global order that no longer served its interests. From now on, he said, the gloves were off. America would act boldly and with unapologetic force to impose its will on the world. This was seemingly the purest expression of Donald Trump's theory of power, spoken by perhaps the most hardline member of the administration. Indeed, America is the most powerful nation of the world has ever known. Its economy is, by most measures, the world's largest, and its currency dominates global markets. Above all, it commands the most advanced military on the planet, fueled by expensive, high-tech wizardry and the daring do of its special forces. It was with this pugnacious certainty that the Trump administration barreled into a reckless, unprovoked war against Iran more than 2 months ago. Trump clearly thought it would be a showcase of American might, unshackled from what Miller called the niceties of international law, and powered by ruthless kinetic action, to borrow a favorite word of Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. It hasn't worked out that way. Despite losing its leader and many other top officials, Iran has mounted a formidable response, inflicting widespread damage on America's regional allies and military bases. By seizing control of the Strait of Hormuz, Iran has grasped something akin to an economic nuclear weapon, sending fuel prices soaring and prompting shortages of key goods in many parts of the world. We live in a world, Miller told Tapper, that is governed by strength, that's governed by force, that's governed by power. The painful fallout of the Iran war provides an eloquent rebuttal. But the Trump administration has done more than misjudge American force and the wherewithal of its adversary. It has fundamentally misunderstood what power is, conflating it with the capacity to inflict violence when the two are, in truth, opposed. Miller's chest thumping recalls one of the most ancient and influential texts about war, Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. Across 8 detailed books, it tells the story of an epic fight between two rival hegemons in the Mediterranean, Athens and Sparta. The powerful Athenians tell the citizens of Melos, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. This declaration is often cited as an realist iron law of might equaling right. But there's an irony that often escapes those who cite the line, perhaps because they didn't read the whole text. If they had, they would discover that the Melians were not powerless victims, but clear-eyed prophets. And what is this but to make greater the enemies that you have already, and to force others to become so who would otherwise have never thought of it? The Melians asked their attackers. Unmoved, the Athenians laid siege to the city, slaughtering all its men and enslaving its women and children. But the triumph at Melos was a false victory. Drunk on the violence they mistook for power, the Athenians blundered onto a far riskier gambit, an invasion of Sicily. The Athenians, initially divided on the war, were eventually persuaded by leaders who believed that the Sicilians were weak and corrupt. They were sitting ducks, unable to defend themselves against so fearsome a foe. It would be an easy victory, bringing Athens greater glory. But strength was not enough. The timbers of Athenian ships enforced a long blockade, rotted. Supply lines dried up. The Athenians, increasingly short of money, had to impose new taxes to fund the war. Finally, in the fierce battle at Syracuse, they were routed. It wasn't the end of Athens' hegemony, but it was the beginning of the end. Eventually, Sparta took its place as the Mediterranean's preeminent power. It's not hard to see the parallels to America's situation. Like the Athenians, the Trumpians saw their rump in Venezuela as a sign of their irrefutable power. And like the Athenians, they overreached, attacking an enemy they underestimated with muddled motives, uncertain support at home, and no clear plan for victory. Entranced by their own capacity for violence, they thought their power to affect their will was limitless. Their strategic mistake rested on a misreading of power. In 1970, the philosopher Hannah Arendt published a slim book on violence. In it, she argues that violence is not a form of power, but its opposite. Written amid America's failing war in Vietnam, the book was partly critiquing the calls for violence among left radicals who opposed the war. Yet reading the book in recent weeks, I was struck by how resonant it is for the American predicament in the Persian Gulf. Power, Arendt argued, is collective, consensual, and relational. Violence, by contrast, is instrumental and coercive, its strength evaporating the moment the threat is evaded or withdrawn. Arendt wrote, "Violence can always destroy power. Out of the barrel of a gun grows the most effective command, resulting in the most instant and perfect obedience. What never can grow out of it is power." We see this dynamic playing out in the stalemate with Iran today. For all America's military prowess, its endless ability to inflict violence, including Trump's barely veiled threat to use a nuclear weapon, Iran has not capitulated. Its brutal theocratic regime may be widely reviled by its own people, but in the face of obliteration, many Iranians have rallied around their government. Years of economic isolation wrought by sanctions have honed the country's survival skills. Trump has been reduced to playing down Iranian attacks on American destroyers trying to blockade the Strait of Hormuz, calling them a trifle. Evidence has emerged of widespread damage to American military bases across the Gulf, turning barracks and mess halls into heaps of rubble and ash. The war has already cost $29 billion, according to the Pentagon, in what is surely a huge underestimate. And American intelligence officials have reportedly concluded Iran could endure the blockade for months. Trump's support back home, meanwhile, is in free fall. In poll after poll, large majorities of Americans say they oppose the war, don't understand its purpose, and deeply dislike the havoc it is wreaking on their pocketbooks. Seeing the political peril ahead, Trump has urgently sought an off-ramp, promising an imminent deal even as he issues empty threats of total annihilation and baseless claims of total victory. Few seem to believe him. As the Federalist Papers famously declare, all governments rest on opinion. Yet Trump has been unable to persuade Americans to accept a modicum of suffering to achieve his strategic aims. For all his defiant projections of unbound command, the war has revealed extraordinary weakness at the core of his presidency, the true puniness of his power. This weakness is hardly limited to the war. When Trump tried to use violence to prosecute his harsh deportation agenda in Minnesota, he was defeated by the relentless efforts of a coordinated, nonviolent civic opposition, which rallied public opinion against him. The vast operation in Minneapolis has been almost entirely abandoned, the presence of federal agents in the state dwindling from thousands to hundreds of agents, not much more than before the operation began. Many of Trump's attempts to rule through the force of executive orders have met a similar fate, be they imposing tariffs, slashing government spending, or building opulent monuments to himself. In the court of public opinion, and even at crucial moments at the Supreme Court, Trump keeps losing his fights. Perhaps it's no surprise that Miller has been awfully quiet of late. His entire theory of power, and perhaps Trump's presidency, is in peril. Yet America, unlike Athens, faces no Sparta. Its only credible rival for global hegemony, China, has shown little interest in foreign adventurism. Instead, it has set about strengthening its power in an Arendtian fashion, through the accumulation of willing allies rather than coerced vassals, using trade deals, foreign investment, and diplomacy. These are precisely the tools that the U.S. once used to great effect to build its power and wealth. The Trump administration, however, has shown nothing but contempt for the patient work of building durable power based on consensus, preferring the blitzkrieg of violence. Last week's long-awaited summit in Beijing underscored the divergence. Our two countries should be partners rather than rivals, said China's President Xi Jinping. For the beleaguered Trump, the scale of defeat must have been unmissable. And you've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. I thought those were some pretty interesting articles. I hope you did too. I enjoyed reading them to you, and I look forward to talking to you next week. Go Sabres. Bye.